Year after year, the World Schools Debating Championship gathers the best debaters from around the globe. This year's pandemic made that impossible, so we took it online. In this style of debate, there are two teams. The proposition team, which is in favor of the motion, and the opposition team, which is against it. Each side features 3 speakers giving 4 speeches. The first 2 speakers generally present constructive argumentation. The third primarily focuses on refutation, while the reply speaker summarizes the debate. For the prepared rounds, teams research the motions for weeks in advance. For the impromptu rounds, teams have only 1 hour to prepare after being told the motion.
Once again, welcome everyone to the partial double octos of the Online WSDC. First of all, congrats to both teams for making it this far. Congratulations as well to the judges. And so just to keep it as brief as possible, my name is Luka and I will be chairing this round today. I have no preference regarding gender pronouns. I would first of all like to invite the panelists to introduce themselves, and then after the panelists, the teams as well. I would also like to ask the teams to write their speaking order in the chat, since we will be filling out ballots, so we can put your names into the application. Okay, so I would first of all like to invite the panel to introduce themselves.
Hi, my name is Belle. I'll be paneling the debate. I'm from South Africa.
Hello, my name is Roberto. I'm from Mexico, and I will be paneling the debate. And I use he, him.
Hi, I'm Robbie. I'm an IA from Scotland, and I'm really excited for the debate.
Hi, everyone. My name is Tamkeen. I'm an IA from Pakistan. My pronouns are she, they, and I wish everyone the best of luck.
Thanks. Can we have the proposition introducing themselves and just writing down their speaking order in the chat? Thanks.
Hi, okay, let me just copy paste it from the chat. Okay.
Okay.
Perfect. Hi, I'm Dimitra, speaking first and fourth.
I am Panayi, speaking second.
And I'm Marilena, speaking third.
Thank you. And the opposition?
Hi, I'm Matthew, and I'm first opposition.
Hello, I'm Gareth, and I'll be doing second and reply.
Hi, I'm Bharat, and I'll be doing third opposition.
Okay, thanks to everyone. And I would now like to invite the first speaker of the proposition to begin this debate. Hear, hear.
Can everyone hear me? Perfect. Just give me 2 seconds. Okay. Women around the world have spent centuries being excluded and silenced in a male-dominated society. They have spent centuries being told that they're not skilled enough to even have a say in global politics, that they always need to act in the shadow of a man. We find this unacceptable to extend that sort of oppression by waiting for organic change that is happening too slowly. It is time for a bold and drastic change. 3 things from Team Greece today. First of all, where we change public perceptions about women. Secondly, where we get more women in politics overall, and in the second speech, you'll hear about international policy changes. But before we do that, first let's take a look at the definition. So by large international institutions, we basically mean like institutions such as the UN, the World Bank, basically when they decide on like international policies and their institutions made to be doing that. When we're talking about only accepting female delegates, this means that anytime a country sends a delegate to represent them in those countries, international institutions will only be accepting the female delegates. Now, moving on to my constructive case. So the first argument about how we improve public perception of women overall. The metric of this argument is essentially us getting less bias and not treating women like objects. So first, let's take a look at what happens in the status quo. 2 main things. First of all, we think that there's quite a bit of bias against them, whether that is explicit or implicit. So this ranges from not allowing women to make their own major decisions and then having to rely on their male relatives. Before I move on to like further, if that's a clarification, go.
If there's already such a lot of bias in society against women, why would the public believe that this woman has been legitimately appointed for her capability in the Foreign Service?
first of all, that wasn't a clarification. Secondly, okay, sorry, essentially what you said, if there's so much bias, why aren't women being recognized? From what I understood, like there's bias, they exist. So like, I'm gonna be moving on to that in a second. Sorry, okay. So this ranges from Saudi Arabia, women not being able to make their own decisions and having to rely on their male relatives and husbands. This also looks like in the US, men feeling comfortable speaking over women in meetings, or even like calling AOC like quite offensive names and calling Lagarde bossy. The second thing that happens in the status quo is that many women often end up being tokenized when they like, even when they exist there, or that they end up like being compared to men. But why is this problematic? Two main reasons. First of all, we think that this trickles down to the rest of society and to women's everyday experiences. So what this looks like is them being treated like objects and being catcalled when they're walking on the street, or them being scared of walking at night because they're scared that someone will attack them, right? The second reason why this is problematic is because it disempowers women and makes them more submissive in the workplace and in their everyday life, creating this cycle. What's the same under both sides is that this prejudice and bias is still there. But what changes under our side is that 100% of your international organization delegates are women. This means two main things. First of all, this means that you have to recognize their capacity, because you give them this huge responsibility, and because the country has an incentive to make them be good delegates, right? They have an incentive to be getting the best ones and to have them succeed within those international organizations. This also means that they're not being tokenized because they can't be tokenized because it's 100% of them there. On the comparative with quotas, we think that there will be inherently compared or even ignored because you can focus on the male and the people that matches your stereotypes and your biases. It's far easier to be doing that. The second thing that changes is that many times in the status quo, you don't really know who your delegates are. But even if there's some women within those delegates, you simply don't know about it. But what's different under our side is that now you know that all of them are women, which means that you're able to like give them this credit and to recognize their capacity, because like in the status quo, you don't give it a second thought when like you know that you associate men with politics. The third thing that changes is you judge the delegates on their merits rather than using stereotypes. Even when we have women being in high positions of power, they're still criticized through stereotypes. So for example, Lagarde is being called bossy. The way that this changes under our side is that even if this happens like periodically or initially, we think that overall this changes because they have to be judging them on if they're good or if they're bad, right? But even if they're initially tokenized or perceived as less worthy, we think that ultimately this perception changes in the long term because one, they have an opportunity to be proving themselves, and we think that they're very likely to be proving themselves because the country has an incentive to be doing this. And second of all, because the countries rely on them for international negotiations and they want them to be in those countries. No. Two impacts of this. First of all, you see them as successful and you understand that they have power and that they're able to deal with that power successfully. This is especially important in conservative countries because they see them as having value and they see them as being something useful to them and relying on them, as opposed to them just being an object. This means that they end up changing their behaviors slowly. So what this looks like is the way that they're addressing them and respecting them when they speak to them. This looks like them thinking twice before catcalling a woman because you know that she is an object. The second way in which you change this is by empowering women through having role models and allowing them to be asking for more. This looks like because you see the woman politician making major decisions that affect your country and people respecting her, you feeling empowered and asking for more. So things such as like you joining the feminist movement in more conservative countries. The way that this happens through 100% females within those positions is that you're essentially forcing them to give credit and not to tokenize them or to scapegoat them. Moving on to the second argument about how you could get more women being able to break into politics. Here we're essentially proving how you're speeding up the organic change in the internal politics. So what happens in the status quo is that 20% of politicians globally are women. This is 1 in 5. This is nowhere near like
information.
out of 2, right? We think that this is even worse when we're looking at the high positions of powers, such as the heads of state. This issue exists because the system was set up by men. So this looks like the Treaty of Versailles being signed almost exclusively by men. This is problematic for 2 main reasons. First of all, because of the internal laws that are being passed. This means that they're either not being passed at all, so things such as like women being imprisoned because like their husband thinks that they tricked them when they were wearing a niqab, and them like seeing them not being as pretty, and such women being imprisoned in Qatar, or secondly, the laws that are being passed simply being too slow. Secondly, this is problematic because we think that it's very hard for them to be breaking into politics in the first place. What stays the same under both sides is that men in politics, like we still have more of them initially, but what changes is that now the women are experienced and they feel welcome and empowered, so this means that they're more likely to be running. This means that they're able to succeed and to get elected in general, beyond just the international stage. What stays the same under both sides is that country has an incentive to triumph on the international stage. What changes is that now in order to achieve that, they have to be training women, they have to be helping women. This is important because at the point at which you get more women in politics, in internal politics, this means that you have an incentive to be educating them. And second of all, this means that they're able to be forming more policies and to be focusing on women-specific issues. At the end of the day, we're the side that is able to both help women on the international stage and to be jump-starting their careers and to like jumpstart organic change as a whole. More than proud to propose this motion.
I thank the first speaker of the proposition and invite the first opposition speaker to begin the case for the opposition side. Hear, hear.
Can everyone hear me? All right, thank you. The irony isn't lost on us when, as an all-male team, we are arguing that we are better for women's rights. But it is worthwhile for us to point out the fundamental misconception by first proposition, where they neglect all the backlash against women who are representatives, women in the diplomatic service, and compromise all the good work for women by international organizations. We cannot support such a world. Our stance on opposition is first, that large international institutions should accept male, female, and non-binary country delegates without discrimination, as is in status quo. Second, what we support instead is a current trend across all countries and within international institutions of empowering women. This looks like increased promotion of women within civil services and appointment of women as country delegates on their own merit. To be clear, we are not saying that the world currently is perfect or that it is equal. But what we are arguing is that the world is improving, but the problem with proposition is that they regress this improvement. Third, the burden of proposition is thus not just to prove that their policy benefits women, but they need to be comparative, to prove that their benefits will outweigh the significant harms to empower women, which I will prove in my case. My first argument is on regressing the right for women's rights. My second argument is on harming important work of international institutions. And my second speaker will argue that proposition creates a toxic environment that hurts opportunities for women throughout the diplomatic service. But before that, responses. Prop 1's first argument is on changing public perceptions about women. And I want to start by saying that this entire argument is a huge overclaim, because they start this argument by raising problems like women being catcalled on the street or feeling unsafe when walking out alone at night. And we admit that these are problems, but they cannot win this debate by only talking about the problems, because both sides agree to that. Proposition needs to prove a unique mechanism as to how having all UN delegates as female will change all of these problems on the ground. They don't draw any links as to how having UN delegates prevents all this. In fact, this is not true, because in the vast majority of cases, delegates actually have no power over policy. They're expected to vote in line with their nation's objectives and act merely as a mouthpiece and regurgitate the state's official line. This means that women delegates have no power to further women-based policies on their own accord, such as making it safer for women to walk alone out at night on the street. This also proves why states have no incentive to train up capable women as delegates, because the job of a delegate is literally just to recite a line that the state has written for them on international issues. Then they have a lot of one-liner assertions in this argument. They have a few mechanisms like, oh, now women cannot be viewed as tokenized because it is 100% women as delegates. But this is not true. You can have all the women who are seen by the public as tokenistic appointments because they are incapable and not trained up by the state. There's no reason as to why just because all are women, they cannot all be seen as tokenized. Then they also assert that they will now be judged on merit. But I don't think so, because given that the tokenism will still exist, people will not be able to see them as legitimate, given that they weren't there out of their own merit. The second argument on getting women into politics, I want to flip this argument. The opposite is true. Because now, when women are brought into even more scrutiny, when they're humiliated by the media and the public because they did not become a delegate of their own merit, but were imposed and installed by propositions policy, that is when they're going to be disheartened and deterred away from politics because their achievements are not recognized, their contributions are not viewed legitimately, because everyone thinks that they're just a token candidate installed by propositions policy. So at the end of my rebuttals, I want to point out that proposition doesn't solve all the harms that they claim, and they do not improve the lives of women in politics. Moving on to our constructive. First argument on regressing the fight for women's rights. So thank you. And this argument will continue to clash with their first argument about changing perceptions. The thesis of this argument is that proposition does not change perceptions. In fact, they send the feminist movement back years in terms of progress. Premise: accepting female country delegates as an affirmative action policy is highly likely to be seen as tokenistic and viewed negatively by the general public. First, because of reasons that I've explained earlier, but also because it is an immense overreach and highly intrusive on individuals' nations' own sovereign right to choose delegates. This is what the majority of the public will see it as. This is bad for individuals all across the spectrum. First, it angers anti-feminist groups even further and motivates them to be even more vocal against pro-women policies. But even for those on the middle ground, who are a crucial voting bloc moving forward to implementing more feminist policies, those people begin to think, look, I'm all for feminism, but this policy seems to be taking it a bit too far because this policy is so sudden and so radical on proposition. The impact of this is that it is terrible for the feminist movement and for changing perceptions for three structural reasons. First, it spreads the narrative that women will never be able to become a country delegate or rise to positions of power without external help. It confirms the stereotypes the public may have that women are inherently less capable and need such a policy in order to become successful. It fuels the rhetoric of those who are already sexist because it's a symbolic policy that they point to justify their sexism. This is especially so given the context of media organizations that are more than happy to criticize the achievements of women in positions of power and question their legitimacy. The second harm is that it actively harms the women who are currently, no thank you, a country delegate out of their own merits. Women who have proven their worth and capability are now all tarred with the same brush of this affirmative action policy, where their contributions are devalued, which is A, a harm to themselves, but B, to all the aspiring women out there who look to these delegates as role models. That is why their impact of role modeling in their first argument also doesn't stand, because they harm the ability of such individuals to act as role models. The comparative is that we recognize that there is already a fight for women's rights. It is not perfect, but what proposition does is that it reverses all the change that the feminist movement has garnered over decades. Second argument on harming important work of international institutions. But before I move on, yes.
So your entire case is reliant that people within society will be humiliating the delegates on which they rely to represent them on the international stage that make international policies.
Thank you. That's exactly what they will do, because they do not see these individuals as legitimate representatives of their own nation. They are angry because these were not the people that they supported to become delegates in the first place. Back to my second argument. The premise of this argument is that when institutions only accept female delegates, this is likely to heavily antagonize conservative countries, many of whom already have a general policy that there are no women in government positions. Countries like Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, Iran, etc. Three reasons. First, because this is seen as a huge imposition of Western liberal ideals, given that there's already mounting backlash against such institutions that are often seen as proxy tools of the West. For the most conservative countries, this is even worse because this is not a policy that they're socially ready to accept. The second reason is because it undercuts the power of such countries when it takes away their ability to decide their own political appointments. Saudi Arabia is likely to see this as an attempt to undermine Salman's power as crown prince. Iran is likely to see this as a policy which threatens the Ayatollah's absolute power in governments. Furthermore, such a policy also takes away the delegate position from other individuals that the government may see as more deserving. The impact of these reasons is that they are likely to either disregard all institutional rulings, or such countries will just leave the organization decision altogether because they don't want to be seen as yielding to something that they don't even agree with. This is extremely problematic because it is precisely these countries that need to be brought into the fold of international regulations. These are the most crucial countries because they are the most prone to conflict where the fight for women's rights is most urgent. When they leave such institutions, it hurts other policies that help women. UNICEF's efforts to build free schools in rural areas for girls, for example, is now cancelled for countries who are not part of the UNICEF development aid and economic stimulus packages that are crucial for economic development, which often leads to more enfranchisement of women because it opens up the population to more diverse and global views, are now cancelled on their side. What's the comparative? These policies are likely to be passed on our side because they are not direct impositions that undermine the power of such countries. Proposition removes all of the important incentives for countries to go along with such policies. Because we believe that we stand for equality in upliftment and perception, not merely in name, we are proud to oppose.
I thank the first speaker of the opposition and invite the second proposition speaker. Hear, hear.
Can everybody hear me? Okay, great, thank you. Okay. Side op has basically claimed in this debate that no change is possible because any change in the state that they have deemed that we should care about, like Saudi Arabia, like Iran, like conservative states all around the world, would never accept that change. We say to you, exactly because of that, we need this motion to enforce that change to happen because the trend that already exists in the status quo won't allow it. That is what we've been basically claiming from the first speech. Everything that the first op speaker has said is the problem with the status quo, and therefore this is the motion that solves that. In my speech, I'll be telling you how we change international policy, but before I move on to that, let me rebut the main things put up by side or pro-op, right? So on our public perception point, they basically never really responded to the mechanisms. They have just done a counter assertion that that would never happen because the public already hates women in those countries, so they would continue to hate them, right? So let's look at what they've said basically. So secondly on the counter assertion, basically they cannot tokenize women, and if only women exist, right? So basically their logic is they would tokenize women anyway. To that point, we say to you, you cannot say women are inferior if you don't compare them to something else, which that something else in the UN or in the World Bank won't exist, exactly because it is going to be only women.
Point of information.
No, thank you. Secondly, they basically claim that the media will go against them and will say slurs there because they did not deserve this position in the first place. Two things under that. One, those delegates still go there with their own merit, right? Like Saudi Arabia won't just pick and choose 5 females, send them to the UN. What is going to happen is more likely to have a competitive mechanism in order to get the best delegates. The government itself sees that they went there for their merit, right? So the whole thing about them not going there with their merit and the society viewing them as such doesn't exist. Secondly, even if they did exist, the media want to protect the state, right? So the media wouldn't go outright and say that our delegation sucks because they went there because they did not merit it. They would say that their delegation is great exactly because they want to prove that their delegation is information. So they can have a greater standing in the international community. They have been unrealistic with their portrayal of the media. Now, secondly, their argumentation, right? So they basically claim that we regress the feminist movement and feminist rights because now multiple groups are going to be backtracking and view this as a radical policy. We say to you that female groups are likely not going to be finding this as something crazy and regressive, exactly because we're fighting for in common ground with them in order to preserve their rights. We say that the middle ground, that they say that we view this as something radical, yes, potentially in the status quo, no, thank you, they will find us radical, but they have completely ignored the long-term benefits of this, right? So to the point that the middle ground is actually starting progressively to view this as a reality in their everyday world. Yes, maybe in the short term they will have some backlash, but later on they will view it as something positive, so they will continue with it, right? Now they basically say that. And thirdly, on that point, they basically misinterpret what conservatives in those countries look like, right? Because we say that yes, those conservatives are bigoted usually, and they are sexist, but they have something else in common. They're really patriotic. What does that mean? Because they're really patriotic, they will have to put their sexism aside to actually say that the state is great and that the US or the UK or France or whatever is pulling the best delegation they have in order to have that patriotism, in order to say that our state is doing something good. Basically, they haven't given us the incentive structures, or why would they do that in the first place, right? Now, the second point, they basically say that we antagonize countries like Saudi Arabia, Iran, etc., for three main reasons, right? So the first reason is that it is even worse. It is even worse than the status quo, therefore they won't accept it. Basically, they have the part of. Basically, yes, maybe the majority of the population in that country doesn't really believe in female rights and does the exact opposite. But we say to you that the elite in like countries like Saudi Arabia and Iran usually doesn't really care about that stuff, right? This is why the crown prince of Saudi Arabia allowed women to drive, exactly because they don't see them as a threat. They actually see them as something that they can gain money out of, right? Secondly, the whole thing about the attempt to minimize power to the government. Basically, we say to you that they have asserted that power of the international community harms the government. There are a parallel structure to that government. This means that even if the international community has different source of power from the government, it doesn't threaten the power of the crown prince. No reason to go against them. So we don't get their second point anyway. So before I move on, yes.
The role of delegates in international institutions is merely to repeat the state line rather than implement policies themselves. How will your side get any change on the ground for women if these delegates do not have any power whatsoever?
These delegates do have power, but they have a parallel power to the state. This we are going to explain to you right now in this argument, right? So how does international policy change? So in the first speech, we say to you why countries will change domestically and like we'll have incentives to push for better education, right? So in this speech, we're going to talk to you about the international policy specifically. So what power do international organizations have? They don't have direct control over countries for the most part, right? They usually have soft power. This looks like setting guidelines, setting goals, trends, or even financial policy. No, thank you. So this looks like setting environmental policy trends, like the cap of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere that we should reach and when we should do that, right? So what happens in the status quo? These organizations are male-dominated, like to a huge part. So so how does that affect policy? Usually people vote on things that are based from their perspective. Identity and previous experiences play a huge role. A man not having the experience of being called inferior or facing systemic sexism is much more likely to overlook problems. This is why most men don't even know what menopause is, right? So they still care about them, but way less than females. This also plays a role with how they debate these issues and how they present them, right? So they are much more likely to be passive with their tone, exactly because they haven't experienced them, and with a tone of voice, right? And they debate them in much more abstract languages. No, thank you. This looks like debating women owning land in a much more financial and bureaucratic sense, not touching about the direct problem that is females not being able to own, not being able to inherit land, right? So this changes policy trends because the problem seems not as severe as it actually is. What's problematic? The policy preserves a patriarchal society. Under OP, you get less guidelines and trends targeted for women's issues. And the ones that you do get are more likely to be watered down in a more bureaucratic, we need to financial problem, and look at the financial problem of the side, right? So what is under OP, right? Delegates are still influenced by their experiences and identity. So as a female representative from Congo, they are female representative from Congo is much more likely to care about female gender mutilation and females owning land. So the rhetoric also changes and the problems and how they view them. Now they still represent the country, but the rhetoric and the tone of their solution changes, right? So they might still be against those laws, but they have to. But the rhetoric is much more to the point. This is important because you get more targeted solutions and more trends, like setting loans, like loans from the World Bank, having conditions for better female rights in those countries. So for all of the above reasons, we beg you to propose to change the patriarchal system and allow for women worldwide to gain the rights. Thank you.
I thank the second speaker of the proposition and invite the second opposition speaker. Hear, hear.
Can everyone hear me? Right. Excuse me. At this point, the main claim of proposition is that by ensuring that every delegate in the UN is a woman, they will be able to make change. If we can take down this claim, their case falls, especially considering the massive harms that Matthew brings to you in his first speech toward the perception of women and towards the inclusion of countries who most need the introduction of women's rights and such programs that the UN spearheads. I'm going to ask two questions. First, how will this policy be seen? Second, on the relationship between the UN and its nations. It's worth noting that I will spend a lot less time on the second contention because there was only one real line of response to Matthew's second argument about how this will cause a pullout on the involvement of the UN. So first question, how will individuals see this policy? Now, the main claim that we get coming from side proposition is this overclaim about the importance of the position of UN delegates. Now, we are not saying that this position isn't important. Obviously, this position comes with skills. But it's worth noting that this position does not have the capacity to make change that side proposition would like it to claim. Because once policy and delegates get to the UN, most delegates, for structural reasons, probably have already pre-scripted responses, policies, and goals. It's unlikely that female delegates have a lot of control over how they present their nation's policy. It's also therefore worth noting that this argument that they run about how the media has an incentive to portray these individuals as the best delegation makes little sense for two reasons. One, in many countries, the government doesn't control the media. And second, in many countries, not everyone loves their government. Like in the United States, the United Nations is the nexus of two things that conservatives hate: internationalism and feminism. I find it hard to believe that there is as much power in this situation as they claim. So why is this claim important? Because it reduces this debate to a question of perception. How will these women then be perceived, and how does that impact the fight for women's rights? Our claim is that the vast majority of individuals will see this as a tokenistic policy. What was their response? They said this is not going to be tokenistic because all of them are women. This makes no sense because people can just say that every delegate who's in the United Nations is tokenized specifically because of the fact that they are a woman. We talked to you about the backlash from men who feel insecure, media who love to put powerful women in their place to focus on the very things that embarrass them. And this doesn't actually matter if these women are capable or not. We on side opposition have every faith that these women will be the most capable delegates possible. But it's about the perception. It's about how people see it. It's how the public chooses to amplify every single mistake rather than every single plus point. It's about how the public says that these women were only there because of affirmative action. It's because of this reason that it regresses the change, because role models are based on the idea that the person was there based on their own merit. But that doesn't happen at the point in which people think that the reason why these women are put on this pedestal is entirely because of their gender. The second thing I like to point out is that this builds a toxic narrative with women's rights. Do you guys recognize what the language of side proposition is saying? Is that in many cases, only women can genuinely fight for women's rights. This is important because it just isn't true. This undermines every single movement that we've been trying to do, he for she, the idea that men too can fight for the rights of women. And I think this also then takes down their second speaker argument for two reasons. One, because the impacts that these women have aren't large, but second, it actually regresses the fight for change. The main question that they're going to ask us in this speech then is, well, what is your alternative? And it's quite clear that Matthew was rather nuanced about this. He didn't say that everyone in the status quo hates women. What he said was that there is lots of people who think that equality and feminism look for good goals. But the massive public outcry is when they think that this policy goes too far. And this has two impacts on the fight for women's rights. One, many individuals will think that the job is done. So if they want to talk about minutiae or the things that women face on a day-to-day basis that make them feel a little less inside, we think that they don't get the political capital to solve this. Two, it also means that they're unlikely to get any form of change because people think that this is a step too far and they don't think these delegates got there in a credible manner. So if their only claim left is on perception, that claim is dead in the water. Before I move on, I'll take this point of information.
So you're essentially saying that these women will face this huge backlash for the choices and the goals that their country has set out. How can these two be consistent with each other?
No, what we're saying is that every slip that a woman makes, maybe a mistake in a speech, every time a gaffe happens that isn't necessarily her fault, the media will amplify that. Second question, on the relationship between the United Nations and important nations. The main attempt to counter Matthew's very complex argument was, oh, but doesn't Mohammed bin Salman have an incentive because the elites in these nations are actually quite ambivalent to feminism? Maybe that's true, because neither of us in this room have mind readers to figure out what Salman actually thinks. But what we can know is that this is an important symbolic policy for two reasons. One, because this is an issue that is close to the hearts of many people. And second, it is the interaction between many strong men and the world. Now, the reason why many United Nations and such nations are willing to accept UN aid to improve the status of women is because there is high benefit in terms of your economy if you can unlock half your workforce and let foreign investors in. That's why Salman allowed women to drive. But there is no real benefit to this policy economically, but a rather large cost in terms of their legitimacy. And that's when these nations shut off. So their response to Matthew's argument doesn't claim this is a massive impact that they drop out. I'm now going to move on to my team's third and final argument about why this undermines the holistic development of women within the civil service. This argument takes like proposition at their best. I'm going to explain to you why they actually worsen the ability for women to advance within the foreign service in an effective manner. This is the case for three reasons. One, because in many instances, this creates a cap for which women can enter into the civil service. And I want you to point out that in many countries that we would consider not as bad for women's rights, there still is a rather large old boys club in the civil service. This is the perfect excuse for them to deflect the pressure that they are currently facing in terms of pressure to hire the best person or to have more diversity by saying, look, we are hiring these women to a rather prominent position, but not necessarily making them go any further. And the problem with this is that in many instances, they don't go further because notions of capability are often subjective, especially when in these cases, the people who make these decisions are your bosses. So we think that there might be more women going to the UN, but we think that there are going to be a lot less women, for example, being made ambassadors to high-profile countries or being sent to allied nations or, making policy at the highest levels of the foreign service because they can relieve this pressure with this policy. Second, we think that even on the ground, you actually get less on the whole holistic opportunities for women. Because what happens when people start out within the civil service is that many individuals who are their bosses choose to prioritize men. And the reason for this is their bias. They will say, well, the women already have a guaranteed position in the United Nations front. Why don't I give more opportunities to the men who are likely to less get opportunities? And what this means is maybe they get 10 more women in the civil service going to the United Nations part of the foreign service. But every other aspect is going to be starved and women are still going to get less opportunities. The third impact is how this creates a toxic culture within the civil service. This is really simple. Jealous men are likely to lash out, and this means less women are likely to join. It's about the snide comments that people make every time you get a promotion. It's what your boss says every time you get a review. Because these women are competing for positions, we think this creates a toxic culture that makes less women willing to join the civil service. Side opposition stands for equality and upliftment in perception, not merely in name. We're proud to oppose.
I thank the second speaker of the opposition and invite the third proposition speaker. Hear, hear.
Can everyone hear me well? Okay. When opposition tells us that the harms of our side come from the fact that the media will criticize women from the mistakes, I think they have failed to acknowledge that that's exactly what happens in the status quo. What changes on our side is that even in the cases where a woman is criticized for a slight mistake she made in her speech, she is necessarily criticized not because she is a woman, but because she is per se a worse politician, right? A less capable representative individually. They cannot criticize them solely on the basis of their gender, because everybody else in that room has the same gender. This is exactly the comparison that we are taking away. And also, they have failed to understand that this whole thing of the media criticizing women also works the other way around, that every accomplishment that happens in the international organizations, that every good thing that a country appreciates their delegates for doing, necessarily has to be attributed to a woman. This is the source of all the benefits that we are getting, and this is what they have failed to understand. Three main clashes. First, on women's rights and feminism. Second, on conservative countries and the impact of international institutions. And thirdly, on opportunities for women in civil services. Let's start with women's rights as a whole. They have told us that pretty much we harm feminism and we promote like anti-women sentiment. So like as an impact that women will never be able to get these positions on their own, and that we harm the specific women that have managed to prove their worth in the status quo. We have 5 responses in this clash. First of all, note how most of their mechanisms are reliant on this immediate reaction, on this immediate change that we are proposing, that will make, for example, the middle ground voters think that this is taking it too far. We tell you that even if this is true, this is very short-termist, because necessarily there's a prerequisite that the person has an acknowledgement and is aware of how the situation previously was in order to have that strong reaction. This means that in the long term, for next generations that are born into a society where it is the norm that women have this sort of representation in international institutions, this sort of immense backlash does not exist. Second of all, even if, for example, we get that sort of backlash, this changes exactly because countries have a sense of national pride that makes them value their delegates. Yes, to different extents, Saudi Arabia will value their women delegates less than Germany will, but they still do, exactly because it's important to them to maintain their international position, to maintain the influence that they currently have, so they will have to somewhat credit these women because they want to view them as positive. Third of all, note that their entire argument on women's rights is entirely focused on an outsider's perspective. They're only talking about people who are not women and how they will react. They're talking about the people who oppose feminism. They're talking about the middle ground male voter who will now think that women's rights are going too far. They have failed to recognize our impacts that we've brought to you since first, about how women themselves will feel more empowered by seeing other women in politics, about how in the most conservative countries, they're able to ask for more rights when they see their government literally telling them that a woman is capable of representing our entire country in the UN. They have more of a chance in asking for smaller rights when they see their government making such a huge acknowledgement. Fourth of all, we tell you that they have necessarily asserted that the women on our side are less capable than the women that are currently making it in the status quo. We tell you that actually, in our world too, there are plenty of women that are as capable as, for example, AOC. They were just not lucky enough to be born in a country that allows them to get the position that AOC did. This means that these women will not be viewed as less successful because they actually have similar capacities. And as the public has recognized AOC, Merkel, and Lagarde to some extent for their value, they will to these other women too. Lastly, in this clash, we tell you that they have ignored the mechanisms that we brought to you about how A, they build meaningful experience in this position that makes them more able to develop within their own countries. Secondly, because by wanting to build good delegates for international delegations, countries having in themselves an incentive to, per se, educate women more, or to push them into politics, to have a larger pool of candidates to pick from, and about how the public will perceive them as more capable just because they're seeing them in more powerful positions. Note how these mechanisms were never actually responded to.
Point of information.
Assertion that like these don't happen and women are viewed as less skilled. Yes.
These are individuals, especially in conservative countries, who already had their sights on another male delegate they thought was more capable than this woman delegate. So why would they be happy with this woman delegate when there are plenty of other better delegates that they can compare to see them as tokens?
Okay, first of all, note how again this is very, very short term for literally the first time that this change happens. Because in the long term, the delegates that will be running for these sort of positions will all be women, right? So this doesn't necessarily exist. But also, we tell you that when they know that a man can't make it into these positions, they simply won't compare them with that person. They'll compare them to the other women that are realistically running for that place. Second clash is on conservative countries. They pretty much told us that like these countries will view the UN as like a proxy of the West and that it's harder to bring them into the UN regulations. First response is that they've never proven to us why this particular change is enough to bring about such a strong reaction. We tell you that these institutions are already viewed as Western-centric to the extent that they condemn things that some countries consider valuable, things like extremely religious states, things like, in some cases, traditional things like FGM. We tell you that these countries right now, they are viewing them as Western-centric. They're still complying by the regulation, at least to some extent. We never got why this particular policy is enough to tip that balance to change that. Second of all, they've ignored the incentives that countries have to assert their power within these institutions. We tell you that one country cannot realistically ignore every regulation of the UN and still have a say in that conference. And because the second part is more important for them, because they want to have an international say, they will actually follow these regulations, at least to some extent, right? Moving on to my third clash of opportunities. This whole thing about how less women get into civil service because like people prioritize men to the extent that women have a guaranteed position in the UN. First of all, we tell you that actually the competition that we create within women, the thing that opposition described as promoting a like toxic environment, that exact thing is what makes us prove women's worth. It's what makes us actually make sure that we have in our societies women that are competitive enough and have enough skill to make it into these positions. And to the extent that we actually try, and every country actually tries, to develop women into being ready to tackle these positions, these women will also make it into politics internally to the extent that they have gained these skills. Because we've proven to you why the public perception around women will be more positive on our side, why we empower them, and why they are more likely to make it into domestic politics. We have won this debate.
I thank the third proposition speaker and invite the third speaker of the opposition to deliver the last constructive speech in this debate. Hear, hear.
Hi, can everyone hear me? Great, thank you. I'm going to answer two questions in this speech. First, how is this policy going to be perceived? Second, who gets more tangible change? But of these, I want to know we gave you a weighing mechanism right from the top, that the second clash on tangible change is far more important to judging this debate. And I think that Team Greece agreed at the start, because notice in Prop 1, all the outcomes were connected to tangible change, about women being scared to walk alone at night and women being objectified and women having better policies to protect them. So I think that their side agrees as well, that if we are able to get tangible change to help women's rights, that's more important than any perception in the future. Having said that, let's engage in where they wanted to clash most. How is this policy perceived? We said that these women would face backlash and that they will spread a narrative that women couldn't succeed on their own. They give a bunch of competing claims. The first thing they say is that people are really patriotic and the media wants to protect the state. Gareth explains to you that the opposite is true, that patriots already hate the UN and international organizations. No response in their third prop, they repeat the same static line from second. But moreover, even if this is not true, Gareth gives you two structural reasons why the media in every country does criticize their own representatives. Just did you see how the US media crucified Hillary Clinton when she was Secretary of State? And note that's such a more important position than the UN delegate. Then they shift in third. They say, oh, this already happened status quo. First, this is directly in tension with the second speaker's response. They have to choose either. Second, yes, it happens status quo, but at least you take away one form of backlash. No one can say in status quo that she didn't beat a man to become in that position. No one can say in status quo that she is only there because she is a woman. Team proposition give lots of reasons why women are very capable. We completely agree. There's a reason we didn't rebut them, because we completely agree with all of these reasons. What we said in first and second was that yes, they were capable, but the public wouldn't necessarily believe it. We told you that people who have this backlash don't actually care whether the woman is capable or not. They can just use the method of her appointment to trash her. This also responds to the argument on how women feel empowered. We think the opposite is true. No, this argument is pretty new in third speaker, but I'm going to rebut it anyways. The opposite is true. If a woman rises to this position on our side, that's fantastic. She fought against oppressive structures and sexism to get there. But on their side, when only women are allowed to get into the position, it's no longer special at all when a woman gets into this position. So women are less empowered on their side. The shining bright example of AOC is relevant here. Do you know why AOC is so powerful? No, thank you. It's because she was voted in. She beat two men to get there, first in the primaries and then in the elections. That's why she's such a powerful role model. You remove the capacity for any of these role models on their side. They then have a response in third proposition that says every good thing a country does is attributed to women. Actually, no, thank you. They just assert this without any proof. Note how Nikki Haley's good deeds are all attributed to the Trump administration's policies. But her failures, her stuttering in her speeches, that's all because she is a woman, she is bad. It is so much worse on their side when you can't have the justification that Nikki Haley is extremely capable because she beat out many men to get this position. So we've proven there will be backlash right now. Team proposition then say, okay, this backlash will disappear in the long run when women are able to prove themselves. The opposite is true. No, thank you. Women can only prove themselves to these individuals if you compare them against men in the same position. The second speaker admits this. On proposition, you let the media set high and unreachable targets to criticize women when they fail. The media can't set these unreasonable standards on our side because then the men will fail them as well. So no, thank you. So we think there still will be backlash in the long run. But even if you ignore all of this, note their benefits are extremely marginal. We told you in first that the case was ridiculous, that the catcalling and objectification was suddenly going to be changed because of UN delegates. I think it's quite telling you never heard this mentioned again after first proposition. Because honestly, currently, no one really cares or knows who the country's UN delegate is. Why isn't this symmetrical? Why doesn't this mitigate our harms as well? Because now, on proposition, the media who are controlled by men can suddenly increase scrutiny and coverage of UN delegates and therefore expose the tokenism. So even if, no thank you, even if you buy their reasons as to why there will be backlash and status quo, it's far less than on their side. What is the impact of all of this? I've taken them at their highest and I've taken out their main pillar about perception. I've proven to you that these women are going to have backlash. Even if they're capable, they won't be perceived as such. Second clash, who gets more tangible change? Team proposition's practical, hold on. Team proposition's practical argument was that more women equals more policies to help women. Before I get into the four responses that we gave down the line, yes.
Do you reject any radical change in women's rights, like owning land in Zimbabwe, since it will bring about backlash towards feminism?
Right, okay. So if this change was because of a sudden imposition of a policy by international organization, yes, we reject it. But if it was because of a groundswell of support from the people that democratically elected the government, that's fine. So now let's talk about the four responses we had to proposition's practical. I want to know that none of them were responded to. The first thing was that proposition have transplanted their arguments from a generic debate about getting women into politics. We told you that UN delegates don't actually have a lot of power. Just like recall your flow sheet and think about how many times they've said the words UN or World Bank in the solution part of their arguments. I think it's shockingly little. Second, Gareth tells you that you spread the narrative that only women can fight for women's rights, so you alienate what's likely to be a large part of your government. No response. Third, Gareth explains to you that you have less political capital on their side because you think the problem is solved. Again, no response. Fourth and most importantly, we give you a substantive that proposition hurts women in the entire foreign service. And the one-line assertion from the third speaker doesn't cut it because we did give you three structural reasons why this was true. First, you place a cap on women so they can't progress to a higher position beyond UN delegate. Second, men are given better postings at the lower level of the foreign service. And third, you create a toxic culture in the foreign services that disincentivizes women from joining. So what does this mean? We win on their grounds of the practical. We've proven to you that in terms of getting policies that help women, we are far, far better in the majority of the spectrum. Finally, on the countries that are likely to pull out, what were their responses? The first thing they said in second speaker was that the elite in Saudi Arabia aren't sexist. Gareth explains that this policy has cost them even if they aren't sexist because it delegitimizes their autonomy. They don't come back to this in third. In fact, they have a new response. They ask, oh, why does this tip the scales and make them leave? This ignores most of the analysis that Matthew gives you because this delegitimizes their governments. They say you want to assert your power. Exactly. How does it look to asserting your power if you let the UN Western liberals dictate who you send from your own government? We think that is going to be extremely unpopular to your people. So this is the reason why I tipped the scales. And note, this isn't new. We said this in first opposition. Why is this argument important and why is it deadly that they never had a coherent response to it? The impact of this is awful, especially towards women's rights. Matthew gives you many examples of what international organizations can do to improve women's rights, like UNICEF building girls' schools in developing countries, like general economic development that helps everyone and therefore increases education levels and is likely to have a better solution towards equal rights. They've been asking for a comparative down the line. This is it. This is our comparative because this is what's happening in status quo, not cosmetic change, but tangible change. I suspect you'll probably ask in reply, why won't there be backlash? We give you a couple of reasons in Matthew. The first is that you aren't having power over your own government. So for example, you aren't outlawing people, you aren't outlawing sending men to school, you're just building schools for girls. Second, on their side, you take away positions from the people they feel who are more deserving. So Mohammed bin Salman's cousin is no longer going to be able to be the UN delegate on their side of the house. Two reasons we gave you in Matthew as to why backlash should be lower for our comparative. Don't let them strawman this in reply. What is the impact of all of this? Even if you ignore the four reasons we gave you why we have more policies to help women, this is an independent solution that is crucial to the countries which need this solution the most. The case of the opposition has been clear. We stand for equality in perception. We stand for equality in upliftment, not just equality in name. We're very proud to oppose.
I thank the third opposition speaker and invite the opposition reply. Hear, hear.
Can everyone hear me if I speak like this? All right. The irony still isn't lost on us that as an all-male team, we are here defending and telling you that women shouldn't all be in the UN. You can practically smell it even though we're all at home. But what we want to hope is that we've proven to you that men too can stand up for the rights of women and make critical questions about why propositions policy is ineffective. Because propositions policy might work in an ideal, but it's actually important to ask how this policy will look like on the ground. And what we said was that for very little benefit, such proposition throws the baby out with the bathwater for too much cost to women. Let's talk about the two worlds that emerge at the end of this debate. And I want to show to you why the world of the proposition delegitimized women in power. Because what we showed to you is that in proposition's world, the media and politicians and those in power and conservatives will always be out to look out for women who fail. That's true. But at least in proposition's world, they can credibly claim that the reason why they got that position wasn't because of their capability, but because of their gender. In proposition's world, they alienate people, and this wasn't just people who are extremely racist or sexist, but individuals who are on the middle ground. People who say, look, I'm all for this equality stuff, but I think feminism has gotten too far. It's for the 70% of women who don't currently identify as feminists. These are the individuals that side proposition chooses to alienate. The only response that they got was, but if they're all women, how can you compare? Obviously, you can compare with other diplomats who don't work at the UN. You can compare this with other politicians. There was no response to any of this. But what we pointed out was even if we took them at their best, there was very little change that a person in the UN could make. Because by the time you get to the UN, you're essentially being a spokesperson for your country's standpoint. That's already been pre-written for you and decided. Maybe you have some leeway in terms of negotiation, but that's at best. So we think propositions doesn't have many benefits for women. Instead, we think that the delegates there, regardless of how capable that we all in this room agree that they will be skewered by politicians, by the media. They don't form good role models because role models only work at the point in which people realize that they're capable. But that doesn't happen. In propositions world, they disincentivize individuals from joining the civil service. They disincentivize the ability for women to holistically develop. We didn't get a response to this argument. In propositions world, they force individuals to pull out or at least reduce their involvement with these international bodies significantly. We got no response down the line on a nuanced claim like this. At the end of this debate, propositions world was clear. They had little to no benefit in terms of tangible advancement to women's rights. But what they did do was regress public perception and prevent women from actually getting positions when they deserved it. Let's now talk to you about the world of the opposition. And let's be very clear about what our comparative is. We are not saying that our comparative is perfect, but we have made great strides in women's rights. What we are saying is an opposition that individuals will no longer have this policy as an excuse to not promote women. That there is a strong push for equality and meritocracy in how civil services choose to develop the foreign service and how they choose to develop their candidates. In opposition's world, we recognize that the UN involvement in things like building schools for girls, or even in terms of female genital mutilation, could still be done. In fact, they were empowered in the world of the opposition because Mohammed bin Salman probably doesn't mind as much when the United Nations comes and helps him develop his nation. That's fine on both sides because even if there's some backlash, he gets a lot of benefit in terms of economic legitimacy. But in propositions world, he gets very little benefit for an extremely large attack on his legitimacy. That's when he doesn't do what they need. So at the end of this debate, it was side opposition that proved to you the following. 1, that these individuals would get better on our side. 2, that the United Nations continues its good work with women in the developing world. And 3, that side propositions policy does nothing to aid in the progress of women. We believe in the equality of upliftment and perception, not in name. We are proud to stand on opposition.
I thank the opposition reply and invite the proposition reply to conclude this debate. Hear, hear.
Can everyone hear me? Perfect. Just 1 second. Okay. From Team Greece, we find it very patronizing and on the verge of being offensive when Team Singapore tells us that they disagree with our case because they fear the backlash of the sexist men who are currently oppressing women in almost every way possible. They ignore the women who are being tokenized, talked over, paid less, and abused. These are huge issues that must be solved immediately and cannot be left to organic change because we know that it doesn't work because it hasn't worked fast enough. Women are still getting FGM, women are still being paid less, women are still treated as less than. 2 clashes in this debate. First of all, where are women globally better off? And second of all, about politics and opportunities given to women. So the first clash. Women delegates will be successful and significantly more successful than they are in the status quo because now the country has an incentive because they now need them to be the most successful possible. They have an incentive to be training them and to have them be like as good of a delegate because they are the ones who are representing their country. They need them. This has 3 offshoot benefits. First of all, women are empowered, which means that they push for change and they don't accept being talked over. They don't become more submissive when they face this type of discrimination. Secondly, the sexist and society as a whole ends up relying on them because now they're forced to acknowledge their achievements and give them the credit for what they're worth. Thirdly, the policy is changed, and you change the policies and the focus on an international stage, because now you take into account women in almost every single aspect, something which is significantly harder to do as a man when you don't even know certain problems and you can't identify with them more, such as, for example, owning land. From OP, we've heard that you get backlash, but notice that backlash is inherent to change, and like this would mean that opposition is okay with no change. This is especially problematic in the more conservative countries, because this change is where it's needed the most and also where they're likely to be facing the most backlash. Then they've told us that the work of the international organizations such as UNICEF is undermined, but notice how this is entirely contradictory with the three mechanisms that they gave us. So like, it's still a Western imposition. It's still seen as like something going against the sovereignty of the country. We don't see why this is any different and why like the UNICEF would be accepted under their side. The final thing that they told us is that like they don't know who the delegates are, but notice that at the same time they tell us that they would be scrutinized so much more. These two things can't coexist, and like they haven't clarified that till now. They can't do it now. We win this clash because the country stays, and because those countries stay in those international organizations and they want the delegates to be successful. So this means that the country must value their representatives. The second point of clash is about politics and opportunities. Under Team Greece, we essentially give them the platform to show their success and to gain enough experience because and then be able to break into politics, because now the public sees them as being far more successful and far more valuable. This is why Yoho would not feel comfortable to insult AOC for doing her job and doing it successfully. And Team OP, they want them to suffer and to pretend that the bigger the struggle, the bigger the fight for equality. We remove the struggle, we make it easier for them to be breaking into politics in the first place and not forcing AOC to have to break through a ton of brick walls in order to be successful. Team Greece gets direct benefits through policies and international discussion. Team Greece gets offshoot benefits that affect women worldwide and in their everyday life, because their value is finally acknowledged after centuries of objectification. We're the side that most help women. Vote for Team Greece.
I thank the proposition reply, and I thank everyone for this fine debate. Now I'm going to ask the ORCOM to move us into a separate room, and we're going to try and be as fast as possible and bring a decision so we don't keep you waiting.
Thank you.
Year after year, the World Schools Debating Championship gathers the best debaters from around the globe. This year's pandemic made that impossible, so we took it online. In this style of debate, there are two teams. The proposition team, which is in favor of the motion, and the opposition team, which is against it. Each side features 3 speakers giving 4 speeches. The first 2 speakers generally present constructive argumentation. The third primarily focuses on refutation, while the reply speaker summarizes the debate. For the prepared rounds, teams research the motions for weeks in advance. For the impromptu rounds, teams have only 1 hour to prepare after being told the motion.